Welcome to class number 5. This is Robin Shobe, your instructor. My deepest apologies. I felt highly pressured by my husband to cancel class and thought a lot about throwing class online and having everyone get online. But I know that we have sort of varying skills and experience in terms of getting online. So I thought that the best choice was to do one more recording. I think that pedagogically, some classes, and if you're going to take my assistive technology or my teacher or technology for teacher productivity in the summer, they're designed to be online, and there are some pretty significant differences that even though you might watch some of these videos of me narrating my slides, it isn't for such long periods of time. And there is more effort put into interactive learning and communication in forums and through other means. So it really wasn't my intention to have you kind of slog through 3 classes like this online. So again, apologies. It got pretty windy here and started to rain. I think I likely would have been just fine. It's been a little bit hard walking the dog around the block. I've definitely gotten my toes wet. But other than that, this will go down as history as the first time ever that I considered canceling class for something like rain. Okay, so let's boogie through. Class might be able to go a little bit faster. It certainly won't be 3 hours or even 2 hours, hopefully. And that is because it's not interactive. So that valuable time that we have when we're speaking to one another and kind of learning wider and deeper, unfortunately, we won't have access to. But save your questions from the last couple of classes and we can have a nice discussion at the beginning of class next week. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is phonology. We've already hit on this subject a few times. We're going to dive a little bit deeper and explore some of the resources that are in your textbook. So I may have already put up this quote too, is that this person, Heron, in 1998 said that basically we begin to teach kids how to read backwards, if you will, that we start by talking about letter sounds. And I think this is pretty true. We talk about the ABCs. We have them start to write letters probably long before we really talk about the sounds of letters, and we may even at times kind of skip some of that. So we are going to think about how phonology can play a much larger role in helping kids both understand language and also use their understanding or their skills related to phonological awareness to be better readers. So phonological awareness is a sub-skill of a broader category. Phonemic awareness. So a phoneme, a single sound, is a sub-skill of a broader category of phonological awareness. So I think in modern day reading instruction, which some of us in the class have probably had modern day reading instruction, and some of us haven't. I would say I've kind of had a hodgepodge of maybe some continuing education, of reading articles, of reading books, but because I was trained as a speech and language pathologist and not a teacher, I have not really formally been trained in reading instruction. But I do think more and more we see that phonological awareness being a strong component of most reading programs. However, phonological awareness, as we will see going forward, might be things like blending, segmenting, rhyming, which are all great sounds. But we're also going to talk about the importance of phonemic awareness, that we really have kids hearing all 44 sounds, perceiving distinctively all 44 sounds in the English language, or whatever language it is they're learning, the component sounds of that language. So phonics and phonemic awareness are not the same. Phonics is when we start to map speech sounds onto letters. So when we start to say k and we spell it with a C, or a K, or a CK, we're starting to teach kids that these sounds can be mapped onto letters. Okay, so phonology and phonemic awareness. So we have a phoneme. If we were to be using the International Phonemic alphabet, the k sound would be represented by a K. So there is no C in the International Phonemic Awareness. In the International Phonemic Alphabet, there is the letter K, which represents the grapheme of C, CH, and K, as in cot, clock, and cake. And what we have, the huge challenge that we know that our kids have is taking the sound of k and figuring out how to map it onto these different letters. So cat has 3 sounds. If we were to sound it out, k, a, t, and it has 3 graphemes or 3 letters. Through has 3 sounds, th, oo, and it has 7 letters. So we begin to see how complicated this task is. So this is one of the activities that you can do with kids. You can really do this with kids of all ages. If you have children who have holes in their phoneme awareness or their phonological awareness skills, this is one of the activities you can do. I put a set of blocks down here because I think you can use blocks, you can use counting bears, you can use post-it notes, you can use whatever you think is age appropriate for students. But you wouldn't show them the word phlegm. Instead, you would just say the word out loud, and you would have the child put a block down for every single letter. So let's try phlegm. How many phonemes, how many sounds do we think it has? F, l, e, m. So I would have put down 4 blocks. I've got 4 blocks and I've got 6 letters. What about think? Th, e, n, k. I've got, again, 4 blocks and now I have 5 letters. What about muscle? M, a, s, l. I've got 4 blocks, right? When I did this online with my the class that I teach in Forest Grove, I had them in the chat box put up how many sounds they thought they heard in each word, and we were all over the place. So it's not as easy as it sounds. It's definitely a skill, and you might even be surprised sometimes that kids are better at it than us adults, and that is because oftentimes they don't know how these words are spelled in the first place, which could potentially interfere with sort of what they perceive as the sounds in the letters. So it's a pretty decent low-tech activity that you can do with kids to really kind of build that auditory muscle of really listening and thinking, what do I hear, what do I not hear? And you would also get a really good sense if kids are telling you they hear 5 sounds when there's 4 or 3 sounds when there's 4, what it is that they're not quite perceiving or understanding. And then you could really focus on those sounds. All right, the challenge of the English alphabetic system continued. We've covered a little bit of this, so again, some review. This idea that we have 40 phonemes, sounds in the English language. I think a minute ago I said 44, 25 consonant sounds and 15 vowel sounds. What's kind of cool is 17,000 of the words most commonly used by adult speakers have one-to-one sound correspondence. So a word like cat has 3 sounds and 3 words. Run has 3 sounds and 3 letters. Old has 3 sounds and 3 letters. If we've discussed this a little bit, if we were talking about the Japanese language, which is a syllabary, so every syllable has one grapheme or one letter or one character, you could say that for the entire language, it has one-to-one sound correspondence. So there are aspects of Japanese that maybe at the beginning are much easier for children to learn, and then gets more complicated later when children need to learn thousands and thousands of characters. All right, we use allographs, multiple ways to spell the same sound. For example, loop, oo, through, oo, through, oo. So we have 3 sounds there, or 3 ways to spell the oo sound on fruit. 4 ways to spell the oo sound. Talk about complicated. And canoe. I'm sorry, I wrote this myself too. Okay, so let's keep moving. So let's do a little activity around allographs. And again, I was really excited to come to class. I think a lot of what I planned in today's lecture sort of lent itself to us doing some actual practicing and thinking about how we might teach kids. So we're going to go across the first row: shoe, measure, ocean, sufficient. And we're going to try to figure out, is it row 1, 2, 3, or 4, column 1, 2, 3, or 4, that the sound is different. So 3 are the same and 1 is not alike. So we're going to go back to our Sesame Street days and find the one that's not like the other. So shoe, measure, ocean, sufficient. So for me, I believe it's number 2, and that measure actually has, when you're saying the sh sound, you're actually turning your voice on. Sh, zh, measure. Again, when I was teaching this this week in Forest Grove, we were all over the place in terms of what people perceived as the word that doesn't belong. This can certainly be impacted by dialect. The way I say it might be different than the way you say it, and therefore you may be absolutely correct that the one that you think doesn't belong is different from the one that I think doesn't belong. But again, as adults with really sophisticated language systems, the fact that this is difficult is a huge reminder to the kind of support that we need to give kids. So we have cord, liquor, biscuit, rag. And for me, it's number 4. So k and g, those two sounds differ only in the fact that one of them I don't turn my voice on, my vocal folds are not vibrating, and in the second one, my vocal folds are vibrating. Now, if it also helps that we're looking at a screen and we're looking at how the words are spelled. So if I had taken the visual piece away, it might be a little more subtle, but for most of us seeing a G, we're like, I can't think of maybe an instance where G and the K sound are spelled the same. All right, so again, activities you can do with students. Now I have 44 phonemes. I want you to know there's 44 and not 40. I was temporarily confused, and that happens to me more than I would like it to. So students who perceive 44 phonemes accurately will be better able to map them onto letters. And I think this really makes sense. And I believe we've also briefly touched on what are the implications for students who have ear infections or temporary hearing loss. So if I have a conductive hearing loss, which means I have a piece of popcorn stuck in my ear, I have a huge piece of wax stuck in my ear that hasn't been cleaned out. This could happen because I have chronic ear infections, or I just happen to be like a really waxy kid. I could have a middle ear infection, which is typically associated with colds or the fact that anatomically, children's eustachian tubes don't drain as efficiently as adult eustachian tubes do, which are the tubes that lead from your inner ear to the back of your throat. You can have, obviously, throughout your early years and obviously into your grade school years, depending on who you are, times when you will have a physical difficulty accurately perceiving these sounds. So what if you're deaf or hard of hearing? What might we do to really support kids to take advantage of what it is they can hear? We also know that many individuals who are deaf with no residual hearing actually do end up becoming very proficient speakers. What if I have poor language input? I just don't have a lot of practice listening to words, and so therefore I don't hear lots of different sounds. If my brain is a mini statistician, I just don't have enough stats. I don't have enough data to kind of crack the code. If I'm learning a second language, especially if that language has sounds in it that my brain has already sort of decided don't carry meaning. My brain has to basically be retrained to not ignore that sound as not meaningful. And then my motor system has to figure out how to produce that sound. And attention deficit, just that a lot of times when kids have attention difficulties, oftentimes when they are focused, they're extremely focused and they learn really well, but it's sort of a moving target, maybe a little bit like having ear infections, sort of on and off. And someone brought up in the Forest Grove class auditory processing disorder, which I promise to talk about more as we get closer to the end of the class. I put this graphic up on the right. It's not amazing, but basically trying to remind us that the way we learn language, the way we learn sounds, the way we learn how to speak is in a feedback system. So I hear something, my brain tries to match it to what it already knows. I try to reproduce it. I hear that I didn't make it correctly. I try it again. If someone else doesn't say it correctly, my brain tells me that there's something kind of off. So this idea that I recalibrate. So I have to both receive input, and I have to have some way of producing output. Typically, to become a competent language user and to learn how to read. Now, what we know for people who might be blind, or people who might be deaf, or people who might be able to produce natural speech, that we do have ways to augment or sort of bypass some of these input-output obstacles, if you will. All right, this is the International Phonemic Alphabet going across the top bar here. It starts with P, B, M, F, V. The next sound is voiceless TH. The next one is voice TH, th, T, D, N, etc. And what this shows you here is what we call distinctive features. And you're not going to get tested on this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some programs that really take advantage of being metalinguistic about distinctive features with children in order for them to better both perceive, understand, produce, and be able to read. So although we might not teach kids, I don't know of a time where we would teach kids the International Phonemic alphabet, but we would maybe teach them that P, if you look under P, it's going to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, there's a plus, and it says it's anterior. So P is made in the front of your mouth, the anterior part of your mouth, and it's labial, right? It's made with your lips. And then you're going to go down to voiced, and it says, nope, your voice is not on. So in the front of your mouth with your lips and without your voice makes P. And B is the same thing. It's anterior, it's labial, it's made with your lips. But if you go further down the column, you see a plus that says voice. So to make a B, I merely turn my voice on. I make a P and I turn my voice on, and I've got B. So let's look at M. It's anterior, so it's in the front. I make it with my lips, right? It's nasal. I use my nasal cavity, not my oral cavity. If you go up and touch your nose, you can feel that your nose is kind of vibrating. It's a sonorant, which means it kind of has a continuous sound, and it's not, and it is voiced, I'm sorry, and that's why you feel the vibration up in your nose, is because you're actually vibrating your vocal folds, and it's resonating in your nasal cavity. Okay, I'm not going to go through every single one, but just to I guess show you that if you really wanted to nerd out on sounds, there are ways to sort of get further into the weeds and to be more explicit with kids about how sounds are made. I like the vowel chart. I think if you were to be someone who specializes in supporting kids with dyslexia or reading disorders, you do really want to find some very explicit ways to talk to kids about vowels, because they are so complicated in the English language. And we'll talk some more about programs that kind of help out with that. Here's another way to look at the chart. And again, you can look on the left. You see nasal, plosive, p. The air stops and then it comes out. Fricative, f. I sort of make turbulence for the F. You can see I make turbulence for TH. And then if you go up on the top, you see labial, coronal, dental, alveolar, palatal, alveolar, retroflex, etc., going across. So other ways for us to categorize sounds. speech pathologists use this quite a bit to get a sense too if there are patterns. So if I'm a child, and let's just say you look at the fricative row, some of the sounds you see here are F, V, TH, S, Z, SH, that j sound that we were talking about earlier. If I am working with a child and they are having a difficult time with all of those sounds, I am probably going to think to myself, this isn't likely a child's inability sort of from a muscular standpoint or a dental standpoint or I guess there's not something wrong with their tongue or their jaw. Instead, it's likely that this is phonological, that they are not perceiving these sounds. Most of these sounds, too, are also high frequency, meaning that they're some of the hardest sounds to hear in the English language. So I might also suspect some kind of hearing loss or past hearing loss and want to rule that out as I begin to support the child with articulation. All right, on to our book. In my book, I have the second edition. Again, when I was on the phone, when I was presenting to Forest Grove, some people had the first edition, which I believe is probably fine. But that means that some of the page numbers are off. I don't think that this is an amazing screenshot. And even though I adore all of you, I did decide not to retype this whole chart, knowing that you had it in your book for future reference. But what I like about this chart, I would use this chart with kids. I would make a huge one of these charts on the wall, is that as we start to help kids, once we know kids really are perceiving the 44 sounds, and it doesn't mean that we're just not going to put any letters in front of them. And by the time you're sort of trying to straighten this out for most kids, they've probably had a lot of instruction maybe in reading, and you're just sort of trying to strengthen teach to their strengths and strengthen their weaknesses. So, but very interesting here. If I'm going to write B, it's pretty straightforward. But if you go down a little bit and you go to J, you're at D, G, E, you're at G. If you go to K, K is hard. You have K, you have CK, you have C, you have CH, you have QUE. So again, the sound, I'm sorry, if you're going to write the sound K or the sound B, or the sound. So I kind of like this chart in terms of really being able to demonstrate to children that these sounds can be spelled these different ways. Okay, I wonder... It looks like I had another one here. So on page 45, I do remember what it looks like. It's a chart, and on the top of the chart, it lists all the consonants, and then it lists blends, and then it lists digraphs, and then it lists vowels, which again, I think is another very helpful chart that I might have either Xeroxed off on the table for kids to take a look at, and when they're struggling on a sound, I'd be like, oh, that sound is hard because it's a blend, FL, FL, right? They go together. It can be hard to perceive both sounds in FL because of the nature of the blend, etc. But just kind of another way to categorize letters when we're really thinking about this task of mapping sounds onto letters for kids. So a couple programs out there to at least be aware of. If your district were to say, hey, I want to send you to Lindamood Bell training, which is usually pretty intensive and very expensive, and maybe some of you have already had it, I would highly recommend it. I struggle with things that are proprietary in education. I know that we all need to make a living, and so, some people make a living by coming up with like a really cool program that helps kids. But it seems like most things that kids with disabilities need cost so much money. And again, I get why it happens, but it also kind of makes me sad that it isn't something that, we don't, kids who are just trying to get algebra instruction don't have to go spend, thousands of dollars in private therapy. Well, maybe some do if they're struggling with algebra, but it shouldn't have to be that way. Okay, off soapbox, back onto Lindamood Bell. So Lindamood Bell, I've been trained in aspects of Lindamood Bell over the years. I feel like if I were to really say that I deeply understand the process, and they've expanded many of the things that they do, I would need a refresher course. But we talked a little bit about vowels and how tricky vowels can be for kids. I went to a conference only maybe 2 summers ago about reading, and one of the presenters said, you teach kids consonants and you just let them know that the vowels are a crapshoot. I'm like, no, there's more to figuring out what vowel goes where than just sort of a crapshoot. So Lindamood Bell does a really good job of providing multimodality kinesthetic support for kids learning how to read. So what you can see on the left graphic, the top third one over is a nose, and you see air coming out. You're probably talking about right? These nasal sounds. Or you're looking at a puff of air is probably P. And the top one in the left is probably L, like putting your tongue up behind your two front teeth. And so this helps children, right, when they're producing the sound and thinking about how the sound is made, to be able to also actually perceive the sound, count out accurately how many sounds there are, actually spell how many sounds there are in a word. So Lindamood Bell, again, having a really strong program around reading in general, but more specifically phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, and visual and kinesthetic ways to support kids in reading. Fast Forward, we spoke about a little bit in class. I was trained in Fast Forward a long time ago, probably 20 years ago, closer to when it was first being designed in the Bay Area. I do know some districts, I believe Salem-Keizer among others, actually have bought licenses so that many of their children who are struggling with phonological awareness or other kinds of, usually things like auditory processing disorder or processing language in general, so kids with attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that's impacting their language skills might benefit from something like Fast Forward. It's pretty focused on helping kids perceive auditory information. So I'm speaking at a very fast rate. And actually, you guys might want to give me some feedback about that if it's too fast, but you can't do it right now because you're just trapped. We all sort of have a rate at which we can sort of handle that we're sort of comfortable in. It's probably a range. I personally like it when people speak fast. I have a really hard time when they speak slowly. I struggle to pay attention. One of the reasons that some people have started to use text-to-speech, even if they're good readers, is that they process information at a very fast rate. So they can actually get onto something like Audible, download a book, and turn it on to 1.25 speed or 1.5 speed or even 2.0 speed, and they can actually process the book more effectively than they did when it was read at sort of what would be considered the kind of average rate of speaking. And then, of course, the converse is true. Some people really need information to come in slower. They need more pauses, and some people need more visual support, more kinesthetic support, do better if they listen to auditory information for a period of time and take a break, which is one of the benefits of these recordings, is that you can listen to it for a while, turn it off, and come back. So basically what Fast Forward does, it's able to digitally manipulate sound and slow sound down in a way that we as teachers and speech pathologists would really struggle to do for children. Try to slow the P or the B sound down, and it's pretty hard. I mean, you could carry an M sound for a while, but M's probably likely one of the sounds that our kids aren't necessarily having a hard time perceiving. So basically, it does cost somewhere in the realm of $1,500 to $2,000 for a student to, I think, go through kind of one session of Fast Forward. It takes place on the computer. It usually requires a child to sit in front of the computer for 30 to 50 minutes a day, I believe, for 4 to 6 weeks. And I'm kind of been out of it a little bit. You can see I gave you the URL. You can certainly could certainly be one of your dive deeper things if you're interested. You can see what some of the games look like on the right, and then I'm going to talk about another activity or another test called the token test. And when you see that slide, what you're going to see is something that looks very similar to the right. So some of Fast Forward has been, it has a lot of evidence that it can be very effective for some children, not all. One of the criticisms of Fast Forward is that the test that is used to qualify you or to suggest that you need Fast Forward is, some people argue, is basically taught to you while you're going through the program, and I would argue that there's some truth to that as well. So that's a bummer and kind of a no-no, but at the same time, I really do think some kids benefit tremendously from Fast Forward. It really can help kids perceive sounds, become better readers, be able to listen to auditory information for longer periods of time and process it accurately. So I wouldn't rule it out. Okay, so the revised token test, I think this has been around since 1971 or longer. It has been turned into a computer version, as you see over here. And basically what happens in this test is the test administrator says something like, touch the white circle. And so a child can touch the big circle or the small circle and they get it right. Then they'll say something like, touch the big black circle, right? So now they have to process big and color. And then they might say something like, touch the green square after you touch the yellow square. So you can see that the auditory information is getting more sophisticated, and although you're just being asked to touch, a series of circles and squares, it starts to take a toll on your auditory memory and your processing skills. So this is one of the evaluations that's potentially used to screen kids or test kids for auditory processing disorder, or for a language disorder, or for a phonological delay or disorder as well. And I'm going to go back really quick, and you can kind of see how Fast Forward, at least one of the games, looks a little bit like this token board. All right, aerobics. What I gave you here is that, and I have loaded class 5 slides into Moodle, so you can download the slides, take notes on them, access these URLs if you're interested. Aerobics could also be something that you choose to dive deeper in. The What Works Clearinghouse is put out by, I think it's funded by the United States Office of Education, and maybe some other funders. It's definitely a great place to go. You can usually type in whatever it is that you want to teach, and it will give you lots of suggestions of programs that are out there, and it will typically also give you the evidence or the research that supports the efficacy of those programs. So there's some research that's been done on aerobics. Aerobics is much more affordable than Fast Forward. They are similar. Aerobics definitely being the kind of home cheaper version. You can get a professional version. You can get a home version. I think the home version you could have kids use, but it won't really give you data on how each child's doing. It will, when the child's playing the game, it will level up for them. It will figure out when the child's ready to move to the next level. And I think the professional version you can have 20 or 30 kids, sort of it tracking 20 or 30 kids at once. A note of caution, a couple years ago, I bought some aerobics and they hadn't upgraded their software. So I ran around the school district I was working in trying to find computers in the closets that had not yet been upgraded. So I didn't, sorry for you all, I didn't kind of look at sort of the status of it right now. What is the latest operating system and whether or not it'll work for you. I do think that you could do some pretty light research and find some apps out there that do things that are very similar to ear aerobics and are much more affordable than ear aerobics or fast forward. But again, you can imagine with the intensity of fast forward that if you had a child who sat in front of a computer for 40 or 50 minutes every single day for 4 or 5 weeks, it probably wouldn't matter what you were teaching them, they'd probably learn. It's also one of the downsides of the program. We know that some of our kids would not tolerate sitting in front of a computer for that period of time. And some of our kids who won't tolerate most instruction for that period of time will tolerate it if it is in front of a computer and they are playing games. So I wouldn't assume that a kid can't handle it until they've tried it. All right, another test, comprehensive test of phonological processing. Again, tests that you could see speech and language pathologists or classroom teachers giving students to really have a sense of what their strengths are and what their weaknesses in terms of having this, very important foundational skill for learning. So I was kind of looking at this kid's score. You kind of see rapid digit naming, rapid letter naming. This kind of speaks to sort of almost, I don't want to say innate, but almost kind of innate auditory memory that this child might really have. They might be able to perceive sounds pretty well. It says phoneme isolation, 37th percentile, which is the very bottom of average. Average is usually 37 to 68. So they've really got some skills in terms of being able to hear sounds. And actually you can see that this is pre-therapy, post-therapy. The child did make some pretty good progress. But what you do see, if you go back to rapid digit naming and rapid letter naming, is that those scores seem to have stayed pretty consistent for this child. Again, kind of speaking to this, that might be something that's very difficult for us as teachers and therapists to change. So we would want to be thinking about how we might support this child. This might be a child that really would do better when they're listening and reading without distraction, listening and reading maybe even with an FM system. Listening and reading with the ability to kind of have some metacognitive skills that they use to make sure that they've been paying attention, etc. Because it looks like some of their memory, and you can go up and it says memory for digits, and non-word repetition is also low. So this child's learning sounds, but is sort of learning them on a system that doesn't really want to hold on to the information for a long time. Okay, so what are phonological awareness skills? So if we were to go to our book again, Henry, page 79 to 86, and I'm not exactly sure if you have the first version exactly where this sits, but I think it has the same title, Phonological and Phonemic Awareness Activities. What I really like about your book is you'll just have it and it'll be sitting on your desk and you'll have some kid and you'll be like, oh my gosh, I know, I can go to that book and I can find these activities, and then you could even take that activity and go to Pinterest or go to Google and probably find 27,000 other ways to make the activity sort of more engaging and more age appropriate for the child, but really be able to address these skills. So rhyme. What most of us know intuitively as parents and aunts and uncles and as teachers is that kids they seem to naturally attend to and be entertained by books and songs that rhyme. We read books that rhyme to them. We sing songs. Preschool and kindergarten are full of it. And we might think that one of the reasons we do it is because they like it and they pay attention. But one of the reasons we also do it is because it really does lay those very, very important phonological and phonemic awareness skills. So when I rhyme cat, hat, I'm definitely doing some manipulation there. I'm changing the C out for the H. I'm starting to move sounds around. And even if I'm just passively listening, I'm getting some of that statistical information that I need to figure out that words can differ in very, very, very subtle ways, and then the meaning's changed. I put up where the sidewalk ends because again, for we're special education teachers and resource teachers and speech pathologists. We know that many of our kids they're too old. They don't want to read The Cat in the Hat. They would be bored. They would be embarrassed. It wouldn't be engaging. But how do we find more age appropriate activities to go back and really lay down this solid phonemic awareness foundation? So again, where the sidewalk ends, that kids are usually pretty into it. Lots of boogers and all the kinds of stuff that you like when you're, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And I put music up because I think there's a tremendous amount of songs and contemporary music that uses rhyme, and so to bring kids' attention to it, to talk about lyrics, to even practice singing lyrics, you could very playfully, skillfully bring in age-appropriate ways to work on rhyme, and probably have to sort through some of those like rapping songs that might not be appropriate for school, but they can work on their phonological processing when they're out of school listening to those. So segmenting is simply that, kids really being able to understand that the word cat is made up of 3 sounds, k, at. So if you tell them a word, can they figure out how many blocks? Can they put their fingers up in the word fan? Obviously, there's lots of different ways to have kids practicing segmenting. For our students who are not able to produce natural speech, it would be really, really great, it is really great to think about how you can say the word and have them be touching the blocks, or them dropping a block, and every time they drop the block, you say the sound, so they're really kind of in control. But thinking about how you can pair, either some switch use or some motor use to be helping kids really hear these sounds. This is also really important for our kids with autism. Oftentimes our kids with autism, some of them, seem to learn how to read extremely effortlessly. Usually we refer to it as hyperlexic, and many of them are reading by 2 or 3 or 4 with very little, if any, formal instruction. But what also happens sometimes is then they really have a difficulty understanding kind of the building blocks of sound. So they know cat says cat, but they really struggle with the fact that it says k, at. So really working to build language up and build language down will also probably help them with communication, even thinking that something like come over here is 3 words, not just kind of a phrase that you can't break those words up going forward. So again, back to our book, Henry, page 67. She gives us a whole bunch of blending drills. I really like the way she lays out cards and the vowels subtly change. She's got I can't remember out of my head, but I think the vowels change, and then the last letter changes, and then the first letter changes, and she's really kind of showing how you systematically show children sort of how these sounds get manipulated in words. And then metalinguistic awareness. This is really us talking to kids about sounds, talking to kids about language, talking to kids about reading, helping them crack the code, giving them actually some sympathy, some empathy that this is hard and this is complicated, helping them have a growth mindset that with hard work they're going to be able to figure it out. But I like this because he says, why do I have to keep writing in these K's when they don't make any noise anyways, right? So some additional resources. I love Starfall. You may also know of Starfall. Maybe those of us who had younger kids not so long ago know Starfall. Starfall also has a series of apps. Some of those apps are very focused on phonological processing. You could put children under headphones, make sure that they get a really good auditory signal to do what looks like playing, but are actually doing really the hard work of figuring out sounds. So, we just did phonology. Now we are on to morphology. And just to give you a sense of where class is going today, we're doing phonology, morphology, and then I'm going to give you a tiny lecture about video games. And I felt like it was appropriate because a lot of the resources that I am suggesting that you look at and potentially use with your students many of them are digital, and many of them do leverage what is exciting and motivating about video games to help kids learn. I have been to a couple video game conferences over the years. I love games for change. I love what's called serious games. And there's a lot of criticism about educational video games in that they're basically broccoli, and that if we put really pretty graphics on them, it's kind of like putting chocolate on broccoli. But then kids really don't want broccoli, even if it has chocolate on it. So just because a video game has been made for the purpose of education, one, doesn't necessarily mean that it actually educates the child. And two, just because it's in a video game format doesn't mean that the child's actually motivated to play it. So just some thoughts toward the end of the class on how we as teachers be good consumers of digital, basically digital media in service of our students. Okay, so the really super exciting subject of morphology. So we just went from phonology, or phonemes, the smallest unit of meaning for sound, and now we're going to talk about the smallest unit of meaning. I'm sorry, that is what it is. The smallest sound meaning, right? There are some sounds that don't carry any kind of linguistic meaning in English or in other languages, and then we're going to go to the smallest unit of meaning, which is a morpheme. Okay. All right, so we're going to start with morphemes. Happy is one word. It has two syllables, happy. And because it contains only one unit of meaning, it is one morpheme. Unhappy. If you add another unit of meaning, such as un, to make happy into unhappy, you still have one word. Now you have three syllables, but you have two morphemes. Un, which means not, and happy. You have two different kinds of morphemes here. You have one that's free, which is happy. It can be free. It can walk around all by itself. Then you have un. It is not free, and it needs a friend, so it is a bound morpheme. So we have free and bound morphemes. Unhappily is one word, four syllables, and three morphemes. Unhappy, and ly, right? So I have one free morpheme, happy, and I have two bound morphemes now, un and ly. Unhappiest is also one word, four syllables, and three morphemes. As you can see here, happy remains free, and the other two are bound. He meets the unhappiest boys. One sentence, 5 words, 8 syllables, and 9 morphemes. So he is a morpheme. Meets is 2 morphemes. Meet is a free morpheme. And when we add s, we have a bound morpheme. The is a morpheme. Happiest is a free. Happy is a free. So un and est are 2 bound morphemes. Then we have boys. Boy is a free morpheme. And s, boys, making it plural, is a bound morpheme. I'm hoping this makes sense. I have no way to tell because my computer cannot tell me how you feel on the other side. Okay, why does this matter? It matters again because, number one, morphemes change the meaning of words, and we as adults use morphemes all of the time. It is part of sort of moving into more and more sophisticated speech. If I am a child who has not explicitly been taught morphemes or how morphemes work, I potentially will memorize words like happy and unhappy as 2 completely different words rather than unhappy as a way to modify happy, and un is a way to modify lots of words and usually means not, right? And if I start to learn that un means not, then I can understand more and more sophisticated language. Now, this probably seems very obvious, but sometimes we really don't systematically teach kids sort of, again, this code and how to crack this code. We will never teach them every prefix and suffix and morpheme that exists, but we can begin to teach them patterns and ways to basically solve some of the mystery that is the language around them going forward. So if we look at the word cucumber, how many morphemes are in cucumber? And I hope you're saying 1. Even though ER looks like it could be a suffix. It is not. Let's look at running. I hope you're saying 2. Kangaroo. I hope you're saying 1. Caution. I hope you're saying 1. Finger. I hope you're saying 1. Reworked. I hope you're saying 3. Reworked. 3. All right. So think of another word that shares the same morpheme. So you can see the first one, they said create and creation. Protect, protection. Labor, laborer. You get it. So again, more activities that you can do with kids. These are great activities to do together, to do up on the board, to make games. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we would determine that a child needed a lot more help sort of understanding and using language. And one, of course, is a comprehensive speech and language pathology evaluation. And part of a comprehensive speech and language pathology evaluation usually is something called the language sample. And the language sample is where you typically sit with a recorder and you try to engage a child in a natural conversation. You write down everything they say. For a language sample to be valid, you usually need a minimum of 50 utterances that you've written out. And you do try to figure out the mean length of utterances in morphemes. And then we have developmental norms on approximately how many morphemes children should be using in their everyday speech, depending on how old they are. And then we do a more in-depth analysis of the phonemes, how accurately they're producing them, word order, morphology, kind of word ending, of course, syntax and morphology being almost inseparable from one another and sometimes just referred to as grammar, semantics, so vocabulary use, and then pragmatics. I see language samples used quite a bit when we're trying to diagnose or determine whether or not a child has autism. And when we do that, it's really important to be writing down both sides of the conversation. So if a speaker says to the child something like, did you know that my favorite color is red? And the kid says, last night for dinner I ate turkey and my favorite thing to talk about is trains. You can kind of, maybe it's not a perfect example, but you can kind of see that the child doesn't really respond to the question appropriately, although they might have really good syntax and morphology and even semantics. We would really start to see this sort of pragmatic or the use of language piece not being what we would expect it to be for a neurotypical child. Okay, so I just talked to you about bound and free morphemes. This gets more important, I think, as kids get a little bit older. And again, I really wouldn't underestimate our children with disabilities in terms of being able to understand this. Again, there's tremendous research done on being very explicit about language, using the metalinguistic strategies that many children with disabilities end up being able to have language skills that can be commensurate with their peers. There's also a lot of research that says that we really don't have any evidence that what we believe a child's cognitive skills don't necessarily determine their language skills. So sometimes, and I've heard it quite a bit in my career, we hear people say that the child's language skills are commensurate with their cognitive skills. So if I'm going to go way back just for 1 second to show you what I mean. Sorry, here we go. So right here we have standard or scaled scores. So I think you can see my cursor if I put it here. I have this guy. An arrow. Here's an arrow. Okay. Whoa, sorry. Apologies. Okay, so 71. 71 is a standard score. So an average standard score. Let's go to percentile scores just for now. It's just a little bit easier to understand. So, I need to stop clicking. So if a child has a percentile score of 50, they're exactly average. 37 being low average, right? 5 being definitely below average. And oftentimes when we're thinking about students with disabilities, we typically we typically consider a child eligible for IDEA if their percentile score is around 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or below. Which is typically 1.5 standard deviations from the norm. So if we were over here talking about a standard score. So if a child were to take, if this over here, instead of being something related to phonological processing, was instead, let's say something, we were giving this child an IQ test. And they came out with let's say they came out with a verbal IQ score of the 5th percentile. And then they came out with an expressive language score of the 18th percentile. Those two tests, the IQ test and the expressive language test, are not meant to be compared to each other. So coming out on the 5th percentile, you are comparing kids to other kids. But these tests weren't designed to be given together. And I do think this is a hard concept and probably one we should talk about more in class. I have sometimes heard people say, well, if the child's expressive language is the 15th percentile, they are operating beyond their cognitive capacity, which, if that were true, it would be impossible, right? You really wouldn't be able to operate beyond your capacity. So instead, what you're saying is that if 100 kids took this test, this child did as well as or better than 15. And on the cognitive test, this child did as well or better than 5. So I just really want to caution you that sometimes it's also used to not give kids services. Well, if the child's cognitive scores are in the something 5th percentile, and their language scores are in the 5th percentile, then they're even, and therefore language therapy wouldn't necessarily improve the language skills. We have no evidence that language therapy would not improve that score. It is not a ceiling. It is absolutely not a ceiling. So, and we can, and I need to put some articles up because this has actually been written about by the Office of Special Education Programs and several other researchers. This is not just me kind of making it up. Okay. So all of that for why do we keep teaching kids language skills even when we're very concerned about their cognitive skills? Because we know that language and cognition are friends, but they're not rules. If you have your cognitive quote unquote level is this, that doesn't necessarily dictate what your language level is, and vice versa. Okay. So what I was saying to you is this idea of bound and free morphemes gets more important as you get a little bit sort of into larger words, more multisyllabic words, and sort of closer to 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade. So what your book really talks about is that Anglo-Saxon words are really kind of our everyday words, like cat and dog, and they're usually small words. They have a lot of one-to-one correspondence, and they can stand alone. They're free morphemes. And our Anglo-Saxon words often use the prefixes un, re, in, and dis, which mean not, right? And occur in 58% of more than 300,000 prefix words found in textbooks grades 3 through 9. So it makes me think that if I was only going to teach 3 or 4 prefixes in my entire life, I would teach un, re, in, and dis, and I would get a whole bunch of bang for my buck, because a whole bunch of academic language uses those prefixes. And as a kid, I've got to know that un means not, or re means not, or in means not, so that I can take that word. Oftentimes what happens is our kids ignore the prefix or ignore the suffix, and just attach the meaning of the base word. So how do we get kids to sort of, again, pay attention to those prefixes and suffixes, and for a little bang for our buck, we get a whole bump in increased understanding of words. Okay, and Henry, page 100. Again, don't know what page it is on yours. I only did part of the word web, but I loved the word webs that they have. There are lots of resources there to just be playing with words and thinking about words and doing word studies. I think it would be awesome if I were a teacher or a resource specialist. I'd want to do like a new word every week or something, and we would play with it, and we would use all kinds of technology. I'm going to show you some of the technology that you could use to do some of the research that you would need to do with kids. And then if you wanted to get really crazy, you could look at some of the ISTE, the International Teaching, the ISTE standards. They're for technology, the international something technology standards for kids. Anyways, we definitely want all of our kids, and especially our kids with disabilities, to have a really good sense of cyber safety and of how to use digital tools for learning. And so you could even think about how simply doing some of these word webs and incorporating some technology could also be teaching kids some really important study skills. So one resource I have here is this guy called Lexipedia, and it's kind of cool. So when we go back, I had put the word word here, and so then I put the word word here, and it starts to give you a bunch of different words. You can see here that I checked nouns. I just wanted it to give me other nouns that were related to the word word, but it could have given me verbs or adverbs or adjectives, and here I could be very metalinguistic with kids about what these mean. We could look at synonyms, other words for the word word, and antonyms, the opposite of the word word, and it might just be kind of fun. You could throw this up on a screen, and then you guys could start to fill out word webs. Snappy Words and wordnik.com are two other kind of cool sites to look at, all of these being free. And when we end class, you will have some time to check some of this stuff out. This also comes from your book, Henry, page 101, and she put up this, which over here I think is and another suffix, so I obviously cropped it incorrectly, but you should be able to find the example on page 101, and then again lots of other examples to kind of help kids see how you can take a free morpheme like this and talk about friends and friendship and friendships and friendlessness and friendlessly and friendly and friendlier, and you get it. But a really nice, just kind of visual way. Oftentimes our kids with disabilities are capable of doing, they're capable of doing a lot. And again, I'll talk about this in video games, but they really need us to start concrete and then get more sophisticated. And oftentimes we start at sophisticated and they don't understand, and therefore we think that they can't do sophisticated, rather than thinking that if we walk it pretty far back and really use good instruction and good visuals and good tools, that they really will be able to do it. She threw a couple games in here, so I just thought that I would show you what they look like in terms of thinking more about morphology. So then we move into Latin roots. Henry, being your author, talks about how important it is to teach them directly, that 50% of our English words contain Latin roots. That it's really important to connect Latin roots to the content area, and she gives you a list of Latin roots on page 125. And this, again, to me is where I think we could do a lot to improve the kids' understanding of complex words, kids who have language delay, language disability, other kinds of disabilities, and really just kids who just have kind of lacked input or good instruction. But you really can take a lot of these Latin roots and you can draw them, and you can find pictures of them on Google, and then you can add, you can start to add the suffixes and see how they change. And I'll show you some more technology to be able to do that. Then they talk about Greek combining forms. They tend to be related to math and science. I would say for most of our kids, science is one of those things that we get a lot of engagement out of, but sometimes keep kids out of until they've sort of done reading and writing and math, which hopefully with the Every Student Succeeds Act, we're going to stop doing stuff like that. We're going to stop saying that, unless you're a really great reader and a really great mathematician, you can't do the super fun stuff like science. So again, Henry gives us lots of lists and lots of lessons. And again, you can see that phone or phono and sound and micro, smaller, minute, we could really do some really fun word kind of studies with kids to sort of deeply understand these sounds that they hear all the time and maybe don't necessarily see patterns in. So this just came out from the Office of Special Education Programs, which is which is the basically special education division under the United States Office of Education, and you can subscribe to their virtual newsletter if you want to, and they usually always have some kind of free resource every month. And this month was this thing called KidZone, which is free, and it has tons and tons and tons of games in it. So I highly recommend that you check it out after class. And as you can see, it's got different age groups. It talks about web games or apps. Most of the games can be played right on the computer. And I saw a lot of games on here that address phonology specifically, and other types of language and vocabulary. So this brings us to kind of the last piece of class here. I'm going to go through a couple of these slides, and then we'll call it a day. And I promise, now I feel like rain, shine, snow, which don't rule it out in Oregon, even though it's April. I will definitely be down there. I'll be in Eugene for those of you in Eugene, and online for those of you in Coos Bay, and at the Douglas ESD for those of you in Douglas, to be able to kind of unpack the last couple classes and to go forward with class number 6. Okay, so this guy, I know it says tier and it should say year. It should say good video games and good learning, and it should say Gee. His name's James Gee, and then there should be a year from which this resource came. And I don't know, the link is here if you want to read the article yourself that I'm going to present. It didn't say on the article what year it is, and I could have been a better researcher and probably found it, but I didn't. Gee might also be somebody that you want to meet. He's a very interesting person. I do believe he's a linguist, even though I said Pinker was a linguist and he was not. He was a cognitive scientist. Gee, I'm not exactly sure what university he hails from, but he has written quite a few books. Most of them are about video games, and most of them are about video games and learning, and specifically language. And so he's a pretty fascinating guy. Didn't really come to video games until later in his life, when he started playing video games with his son, his grandson, I believe, and has really just done a lot of research. He's a really interesting person, maybe a little bit controversial, especially if you he's like really, 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 really liberal, which good or bad or indifferent, just you're forewarned. Okay, so basically I'm going to go there. There's these red, I'm going to go through these red titles. So one of the first thing he talks about in video games is this idea of identity. And what this whole article tries to say is many video games do this well, whatever these titles are, and schools could do them well, but they don't always do them well. And not that schools need to be full of video games and that kids need to play video games all day long, but instead, why are video games so sticky and so appealing to children? Why are some children who, especially I think about many of our children with disabilities, who struggle to demonstrate some of the skills that we would like them to have, and then are amazing in this digital environment? And I've sat in a lot of IEP meetings where families have been like, yeah, but have you seen my kid, whatever it is, build an alternative universe in Minecraft? And the IEP team's like, yeah, but, he can't brush his teeth, right? How do we look at what this child can do in this alternate, in this digital space, that doesn't mean then necessarily bring Minecraft into the classroom, although it might. But why are they successful in that environment and not others? And what a lot of video game research will say is that the ability to be successful in video games actually can be very frustrating, is actually quite hard work, and some really tremendous, amazing learning goes on. And we can, and this is really a conversation that's, of course, much better had face to face, because you will not all agree with this article, and that's okay. So it might be something that you want to dive deeper on, but maybe it'll roll around in your head in the future as you're thinking about, different ways to support students to learn going forward, and what a 21st century learner looks like. Okay, so the first one is identity. And what you'll also see here, if you read the whole slide, which I'm not going to read to you, is that he talks about playing a whole bunch of games I've never even heard of, let alone never played. And just 2 minutes of feeling sorry for myself, my first exposure to video game was Atari, and the control stick and the shooter, the button that shoots, was really difficult for me, because I had to kind of like cross my arm over it was just very hard for me to, so I actually, video games I think actually made me feel disabled. And so I think maybe that's a blessing, but it's one of the reasons why I don't think that I took to video games as a young child. And also, I don't know, I could only sort of spend so much time, trying to blow up an asteroid before I really wasn't that entertained. And obviously video games look much different now than they did then. Okay, identity. Blah. So identity is really important. And when I think about students with disabilities, one of the things I'm very concerned about, and would, if I had more time, spend a lot of time researching and thinking about and trying to support others, is how do we support children with disabilities to have a very healthy identity to, I know as a child with a disability that might even be considered mild, my identity was highly impacted by the fact that I didn't have a hand, by the teasing, by the things that I couldn't do versus the things that I could do. And one thing that happens right in the digital space is I only have to reveal whether I have a disability if I want to. It is my choice. So digital spaces being actually a very safe place in terms of identity, potentially a safe place. I'm not saying that digital environments are inherently safe. So one, all of us, whether we have a disability or whatever it is, when we go into a video game space, we have a lot of control over identity, and we can change our identity. I can be a female one day, I can be a male the next day, I can be a person with a disability, I can be a panda, I can be a mermaid, I can be a lot of things, right? But it's also learning. I can try out those identities in a place where I'm potentially safe and not punished. That's not true at school. I try out something funky at school, and people might not forget it for 4 years, right? That I wore that thing, or I did that thing, or I said that thing, or so there's a lot of risk to identity in the real world. And this is one of the places where kids can kind of explore and try to figure out who they want to be. So the other piece around identity, which there's a lot of research, is that in order to be an effective learner, you take on the identity of a learner. And so this would move us far away from sort of behavioral type learning theory or learning strategies where I learn because I'm rewarded. Instead, I learn because it's who I am, it is who I want to be, and it's who I want to be in that moment. So there's quite a few articles written about if you're a science teacher, you really want your students in class to take on the identity of scientists. You might even have them put on white coats and goggles and talk about what scientists do and what they talk about and what they think. And we play scientists in order to be good learners, or we play mathematicians, or we play famous authors, etc. And you can see how this might be a more engaging way to approach learning. Okay, that's identity. So interaction, basically there is a research out there that most educators are kind of familiar with, and his name is Hattie. And Hattie, I believe, comes from England. And what Hattie does is he writes books where he takes, let's say, all of the research that's been done on small group instruction. And then he figures out which research studies were the most quality, and he figures out sort of what was kind of over and over and over again found that when you use small group instruction, it's effective to do whatever it is. And then he gives it a rating. And one of the highest teaching strategies that Hattie rates the highest, wow, I really said that well, is feedback. That there are few things that support student learning more than teacher feedback. And what Guy would argue is that one thing video games are very good at is continuous feedback. Again, does that mean that you as a teacher can turn yourself into a video game? Not necessarily. But there's this idea that that games talk back. Nothing happens until a player acts and makes decision. Then the game reacts back, giving the player feedback and new problems, right? So for some of our students, we ask them to do a lot of independent work. How often are we able to provide feedback? Sometimes we are actually able to use some kind of digital tool or video game to increase how much feedback a child gets so that they can learn a skill quicker. In my mind, multiplication is an excellent thing to be learning on the computer, where you're rapidly being supported in your learning and rapidly giving feedback, and not really being allowed to practice at a level that's too high and practice mistakes. So he kind of says, so too in school, texts and textbooks need to be put in context of interaction where the world and other people talk back. So this idea that we really don't want our students kind of in this passive situation with learning, that we really want them talking, communicating, relating it to their lives, researching, asking questions, responding to questions, building things, etc. Okay, production. Players are producers, not just consumers. They're writers, not just readers. They co-design games by the actions they take and the decisions they make. And so if you skip down to the bottom, he says players help write the worlds they live in. In school, they should help write the domain and the curriculum they study. That one's big. And I might even say, do they get to write the world, that they learn in? Do we have a world that's very responsive to what it is to be a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old? Or have we kind of perpetuated the industrial kind of age design of classrooms, which really doesn't seem to be serving children well, especially in Oregon, or we wouldn't have the graduation rate that we have. Risk-taking. Video games lower the consequences of failure. So for most of us, let's say we've played Angry Birds. You pretty much don't play Angry Birds unless you expect to fail often, many, many, many times before you pass each level. And you don't feel stupid. Maybe for a minute or two I have, but it's not something that's bone-crushing. The players are really encouraged to take risks, explore, and try new things. And I talked about this a little bit when I was talking about AAC, around even just having an AAC device as something that you need to explore, that you need to play with. What does this button say? What does that button say? If I hit it again, does it say the same thing? What if I put these two words together? Does it make people laugh? Does it make sense? Right? How much exploring or sort of productive play do we provide kids? So again, here's Guy saying school too often allows much less space for risk, exploration, and failure. So we're pretty rule governed. We don't really reward kids for taking risks. I think this idea about failure and what we learn from failure is really taking hold in education right now. I'm sure I'm not the first person that's sort of talking about how do we make classrooms a much safer place for kids to take risks. How do you get kids raising their hand and often having questions or having the wrong answer? Then you know that you've really provided an environment where people feel free, kids feel free. I would even use some behavioral strategies where I really reward kids who ask questions, whether it's right or wrong. There's actually an article, which I should find for you as well, that I believe was in The Economist, and it talks about math instruction in Japan, where they basically start each class with either a problem that the kids have never been taught, and they sit and they all work together to try to solve it. So using that real inquiry-based type instruction, or they start the class with a student's incorrect response to a question. And because it is the culture of the class, kids actually are, this is no problem. They're not intimidated. Instead, it means that they worked and they tried, and nobody expects them not to get the answer correctly until they work together as a group. Okay, customization. Players can, usually in one way or another, customize a game to fit with their learning and playing styles. I think us as special educators, we're pretty awesome at this. We do this really, really, really well. But to just think about, what if, this kind of goes back to the idea of universal design for learning, what if this was done better by all teachers and in all classrooms, right? We would have... we would be able to handle a wider range of diversity, and we would be more flexible. So customized curricula in school would not just be about self-pacing, but about real intersections between the curriculum and the learner's interests, desires, and styles. I have given a talk several times about what's called transmedia play, and it's this idea that kids play among different media platforms. And I usually use Harry Potter as the example, where you have kids who read the books, they watch the movies, they go to Disneyland, they go on Facebook pages, they have stuffed toys, they make crafts, they I think I could go on and on, right? You can really see that kids who like Harry Potter can play across a wide variety of media, and that you can go from very young to adults who are interested in Harry Potter. But what if I get to use Harry Potter to write about, or to solve math problems, or to put on a play, or to do research, etc., that we really can kind of bring children's interests into to sort of fuel the higher learning that we would like them to see. So agency means control. I do believe that many of our students with disabilities, number one, I think we as special educators are very good at knowing that kids need choice. I think we're very good at it. But just this idea that our kids really need authentic choices and authentic voice and authentic say in what they do. Well-ordered problems. Just basically this idea that video games, and the next one is, well, let's look at all three of these at once. Well-ordered problems, challenge and consolidation, and just-in-time and on-demand. Video games provide typically a very clear goal-oriented adventure, if you will, or question or thing that needs to be solved. And kids know when they're getting closer to solving it, and they know when they've solved it. So it's very clear to them what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, even if it's, something silly like, not get killed in an asteroid field. And so the learning is very clear. The time that it takes, they're constantly getting feedback by either having not moving up levels or moving up levels, etc. And video games are very good at giving students what's called just-in-time and on-demand support while they do it. So they're not just sort of left there to fail over and over and over again. You'll actually get more support as you fail, and you'll get less support as you go forward. So to me, it's perfect zone of proximal development, Vygotsky scaffolding. And again, we're not necessarily saying that kids play video games all the time, but that one of the reasons that I would do something that's hard and frustrating is because I know I'm not going to be left to do something hard and frustrating forever. I'm going to get the assistance I need, and if I keep practicing, I will actually do better. If our kids had that kind of confidence in school and with the learning tasks that are put in front of them, we might see a lot more persistence. Okay, why are we talking about this in language class? People are poor at learning what words mean when all they get is a definition that spells out what a word means in terms of yet other words. Recent research suggests that people only really know what words mean and learn new ones when they can hook them to the sorts of experiences they refer to, that is, to the sorts of actions, images, or dialogues that the real world relates to. You will never find me ever send a kid home a list of vocabulary to go home and learn. Instead, we learn because we live. We learn because we go to the zoo. We learn because we go to the ocean. We learn because we build a tower in class out of blocks. We learn. I think video games might be one of the, depending on the game, one of the most language-rich experiences we can provide children. Now, if it's just a visual game with music, there's so much vocabulary there. Sitting next to a child and talking about the vocabulary, or recreating the video game on a piece of paper and a drawing, and then labeling what those images are and what those things in the video game are, and what they're called, is a fabulous, very deeply contextual way to learn words. Pleasantly frustrating, I already kind of jumped on that most kids, most people are in a state of flow if they're playing a good video game. There's a ton of research. Again, you could do something on that if you wanted, which is this idea of flow and what it takes to become or to get into a state of flow. And that research suggests that that there really is no other way to as consistently get into a state of flow as video games. Now, I believe that I get into a state of flow when I'm cross-stitching, not usually when I'm knitting, sometimes when I'm running, well, maybe years ago when I was running, sometimes when I'm writing my dissertation, most of the time not. But how do we get kids, if you will, into a state of flow, which is a deeply engaged into the learning? And that doesn't always mean that the learning is exactly what they want to do, but they're really dedicated in the moment and sort of have forgotten that learning is something that is hard work. Systems thinking, we talked a little bit about this. I think I talked about it in the Forest Grove class. And one of the things that is difficult for our students, especially our students who receive the majority of their education in a life skills class, is that one of the things that we do in order to support their learning is to try to simplify their environment. And we simplify their routine, we simplify their transitions, we might simplify even how many kids are in the room, we might make tasks very routine and clear, and none of those things are bad. All of those things are highly research supported and are likely very effective in helping many of our kids be able to engage in many of the successful things that they do during school. The problem, though, is, number one, if that's the environment I'm in school, is that the environment I basically need to be in for the rest of my life? Have we maybe unintentionally failed to prepare kids for more complex environments that they will be in when there's no longer school? How do we sort of create some of that complexity? And again, just sort of thinking about, are there, and maybe they're not invented yet, some ways for our kids to experience some of the real world complexity that we want to prepare them for in their real lives or their lives out of school, that we could do in the learning environment. And I think we try to do this as teachers. We talk about generalization, we talk about practicing skills in other places, but are there things that potentially a digital environment could do to help kids with systems thinking? We're thinking about cause and effect. We're thinking about multiple variables, etc. Okay, explore, think laterally, rethink goals, smart tools and distributed knowledge. We talked about situated knowledge and we talked about distributed knowledge on the very first class. This idea that I love technology, so this idea that we can use technology as smart tools, that we can use them to extend our abilities. For those of us with disabilities, sometimes we can use them to augment our disabilities, or maybe meaning that So we could just think about glasses, that if I can't see very well and I put glasses on, I can see better, and I've augmented a weakness of mine. And sometimes using technology and good tools to just completely bypass a disability in general. But the 21st century and the workplace is full of tools. It's full of smart tools. It's full of shortcuts, and nobody makes fun of you for using them. So how do we teach kids that sort of all knowledge doesn't have to just sort of sit in their head, that it can be distributed between them and the good tools they use? This might be a daily planner. This might be how to access my phone number and address on a smartphone. This might be how to ask an adult for help if I'm out in the community and I've lost my way, etc. And hopefully this is the last one, because it's a really long kind of soapboxy lecture, but performance before competence. This is totally Vygotsky, this idea that I start pointing before I really know what it means, that a lot of times in video games I practice a skill before I actually have to use that skill in real life. So and he, again, being a linguistic, ends with, this is how language acquisition works, though not always schools, which often demand that students gain competence through reading texts before they can perform in the domain they are learning. So this kind of means, if you want me to read about, maybe you want me to read about Victorian England. It would be really helpful if I knew a whole bunch of stuff about Victorian England before you made me read it. Because it's likely that there'll be things in the book that I don't understand, because I've never seen that kind of dress. I've never seen a road that looks like that. I've never seen a home made like that. I didn't know that people didn't have cars, etc. Again, how do we provide the context that kids need in order to then be able to deeply understand some of the things that we ask them to do in school? Okay, that's the end of the slideshow. I talked 200 miles an hour. I would love it if before class you went and checked out some of these resources, particularly KidZone. I don't think these are necessarily the most high quality games you've ever seen, but I would love your thoughts on how we use some of these digital tools in class when we get together next week. All right, take care. Thank you for being understanding about me not driving in puddles of water. Bye, y'all.